The cause of the Portland Max train killings did not begin with a knife. It began with a system that repeatedly absorbed open hostility without consequence. Public transit is built on tolerance. Riders endure discomfort because it is temporary. They accept harassment as something to outlast rather than confront. Authority feels distant, and responsibility feels shared to the point of invisibility. These conditions are not accidental. They are structural, and when hostility enters that structure unchecked, it learns that escalation is possible. On the night of May 25, 2017, Jeremy Christian boarded a Portland Max light rail train and harassed Demetria Hester, a well-known civil rights activist. He shouted racist and anti-Muslim rhetoric. The encounter was frightening but ended without physical violence. No arrest followed. The system registered the behavior and moved on. When aggressive behavior meets no resistance, it does not disappear, it rehearses. The next day, May 26, 2017, Christian boarded another Max train. The system was the same. The assumptions were the same. The passengers were different. He began shouting racist and Islamophobic slurs at two teenage girls. One of them was Muslim and wearing a hijab. Witnesses later testified that the language was loud, sustained, and hostile. The girls attempted to move away. Christian followed them through the train, continuing to shout. Other passengers noticed. Some repositioned themselves. No conductor was present in the car. No authority intervened. The train kept moving. This is how the system holds tension in place. 3 passengers chose to interrupt it. Taliesin Namkai Meche, a recent college graduate, moved closer to the girls. Ricky Best, a U.S. Army veteran and father of 4, stood with him. Micah Fletcher joined them. Their intent, as established through trial testimony, was to end the harassment. At first, the confrontation remained verbal, but it intensified. According to multiple witness accounts, Namkai Meche raised his cell phone and began recording Christian. The act was an attempt to document behavior that had already crossed social boundaries. Christian reacted immediately. He struck the phone from Namkai Meche's hand, sending it to the floor of the train. That moment shifted the encounter from tolerated hostility to open conflict. According to sworn trial testimony, Micah Fletcher then pushed Christian twice, attempting to force him backward and away from the girls. Namkai Meche was physically involved in the effort to separate Christian from them. No one displayed a weapon. No one expected lethal violence. But inside a confined system, physical contact collapses time. Christian pulled a folding knife. Police affidavits later identified it as a folding knife with a blade approximately 3.75 inches, 9.5 centimeters, long. From the moment the knife was drawn, the stabbings occurred in approximately 11 to 12 seconds. There was no pause, no opportunity to retreat. Namkai Meche was stabbed in the neck and collapsed. Best was stabbed in the chest. Fletcher was stabbed and critically injured but survived after emergency surgery. The 2 teenage girls were not physically harmed. Passengers activated the emergency stop. Panic spread through the car. Some riders fled. Others attempted first aid. The train, the same system that had enforced silence minutes earlier, was now a site of uncontrolled crisis. Christian exited the train and ran. On the platform, witnesses pursued and surrounded him. When police arrived, Christian did not comply passively. According to arrest affidavits, he threw his folding knife toward a police vehicle before being taken into custody. He was then arrested without further injury to others. The violence did not end cleanly. As Ricky Best lay dying, an unrelated bystander stole his backpack and wedding ring. The theft was discovered during the investigation. The individual responsible was later identified, arrested, and sentenced to prison. The act was separate from the attack itself, but it exposed how quickly social norms fracture after extreme violence, not only toward aggression, but toward exploitation. Christian was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Repeated competency evaluations and frequent courtroom disruptions prolonged the legal process. He used hearings to voice extremist rhetoric. At sentencing, Christian was removed from the courtroom after yelling, "I should have killed you," at one of the survivors. In February 2020, a jury convicted him on all major counts. In June 2020, he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus additional prison time for related offenses. During sentencing, families spoke. Best's children described losing their father. Namkaimecha's parents spoke about a son who believed deeply in protecting others. Fletcher addressed survival and long-term recovery. These statements anchored the case in consequence rather than ideology. Second case. Public transportation is built to move people efficiently through a city. It is shared space, governed by schedules and systems rather than personal relationships. On August 22, 2025, that shared trust collapsed aboard a Lynx Blue Line train when a routine ride turned fatal. That night, Irina Zarutska, a 23-year-old Ukrainian refugee, boarded the train at the Skalibark station. She had just finished a shift at a pizzeria and was still wearing her work uniform. Like many service workers in Charlotte, she relied on public transit to get home. The ride was expected to last only minutes. It did not. Surveillance footage later reviewed by investigators showed DeCarlos Brown Jr., 34, boarding the same train and sitting directly behind Zarutska. For approximately 4 minutes, the two remained seated without any visible interaction. There was no conversation, no confrontation. Other passengers were present, absorbed in their own routines, unaware that anything was about to happen. The train continued northbound toward the East/West Boulevard station, one of the busiest stops along the line. Inside the rail car, everything appeared ordinary. That sense of normalcy ended abruptly. Without warning, Brown attacked. Zarutska was stabbed multiple times while still seated. The assault was sudden and unprovoked. Passengers nearby reacted immediately, pulling emergency alarms as the train slowed approaching the station. When the train stopped, riders moved away, some attempting to render aid while others alerted authorities. Charlotte-Mecklenburg police officers and emergency medical responders arrived within minutes. Despite the rapid response, Zarutska's injuries were fatal. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Brown was detained on the platform without resistance. Law enforcement later confirmed that surveillance audio and witness statements captured Brown making a racially charged remark following the attack, reportedly saying, "I got that white girl." That statement became a key evidentiary point as investigators examined motive. Prosecutors emphasized that while the attack appeared unprovoked, conclusions about intent would be determined through the legal process. The train line was temporarily shut down. Passengers were evacuated. Police tape cordoned off the platform and rail car. For several hours, the East/West Boulevard station functioned not as a transit hub, but as a crime scene. News of the killing spread quickly across Charlotte and beyond. Irina Zarutska had arrived in the United States after fleeing Ukraine during a period of active war and displacement. She was resettled through refugee programs designed to provide safety and a chance to rebuild. Friends and co-workers described her as focused and hardworking, intent on establishing a stable life through steady employment. She relied on public transportation, a common reality for many newcomers and service workers. Her death resonated deeply within immigrant and refugee communities, not only in Charlotte but internationally. To many, the setting of the killing carried particular weight. A public train is meant to be neutral ground, a place where people coexist briefly and move on. That expectation failed her. Memorials appeared near the station in the days that followed. Flowers, handwritten notes, and Ukrainian flags were placed along fencing and platforms. Vigils brought together residents, transit workers, and community advocates who viewed Zarutska's death as more than an isolated crime. Brown was charged in Mecklenburg County with first-degree murder. Because the killing occurred aboard an active light rail train, federal authorities also filed charges under statutes governing violent acts on mass transportation systems. The federal case elevated the incident beyond a local homicide. Prosecutors framed it as a crime with national transportation safety implications, citing the vulnerability of enclosed public transit environments. In April 2026, a Rule 24 hearing was scheduled to determine whether federal prosecutors would formally seek the death penalty. That hearing marked a critical point in the case, placing it among a small number of transit-related killings considered for capital prosecution at the federal level. One of the most significant outcomes of the killing occurred not in the court, but in the state legislature. In late 2025, North Carolina lawmakers passed House Bill 307, commonly referred to as Irina's Law. The legislation introduced reforms to criminal justice procedures and reopened pathways toward capital punishment in certain aggravated cases. Supporters argued that the Zarutska killing exposed weaknesses in how the legal system addressed extreme violence in public spaces tied to mass transportation. The bill followed months of debate. While critics raised concerns about broader implications, its passage demonstrated how profoundly the case had shaped state-level policy discussions. The killing drew attention far beyond Charlotte. International outlets, including the BBC, reported on the case, emphasizing Zarutska's refugee background and the public setting of the attack. In the United States, the incident became part of a broader national conversation about safety on public transit systems. At the federal level, Donald Trump publicly condemned the attack, describing it as a failure of urban transit security. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy echoed those concerns, warning that federal transit funding could be reconsidered if agencies failed to address safety deficiencies. Those statements marked a rare moment when a single transit homicide directly influenced national funding and oversight discussions. In February 2026, the Federal Transit Administration released its final audit report on the Charlotte area transit system. The audit identified shortcomings in surveillance monitoring, emergency communication protocols, and coordination between transit staff and law enforcement. While the report did not conclude that the killing could have been definitively prevented, it stated that existing gaps increased risk and delayed situational awareness during critical moments. The findings were cited by lawmakers and transit agencies across the country as justification for reviewing safety standards on light rail systems. In January 2026, a federal court ordered DeCarlos Brown Jr. to undergo a psychiatric examination to determine his competency to stand trial. Brown, who was diagnosed with schizophrenia before the attack, remains in custody on both state and federal murder charges. In honor of these victims, please like the video and subscribe to the channel to help keep their memories alive. Thank you. Third case. Colin Ferguson wrote down his reasons before he ever boarded the train. In handwritten notes later recovered by investigators, he listed what he believed were the forces aligned against him. He cited grievances involving Adelphi University, the New York State Workers' Compensation Board, and a broader belief that he was being deliberately targeted and undermined. The notes were titled simply, "Reasons for This." They were not written in the aftermath. They existed beforehand, framing the violence as an act he believed was justified. The motive did not point to specific individuals. Ferguson had no personal relationship with the people he would encounter that evening. The passengers were strangers, yet investigators later noted a pattern. While he fired at whoever was immediately accessible, the victims were almost exclusively white and Asian. That distribution aligned with the racial grievances expressed in his notes. Proximity determined opportunity. Ideology shaped perception. The violence that followed was not impulsive. It was filtered through belief. On the evening of December 7, 1993, Ferguson carried that belief system into Penn Station in Manhattan. Just after 5:30 p.m., he boarded a Long Island Railroad commuter train heading east toward Nassau County. He did not attract attention. He was not questioned. He was not delayed. To the people around him, he looked like every other commuter starting the ride home. That moment, the ease of entry is the first threshold in this story. The system functioned exactly as designed, and in doing so, it offered no resistance. The Long Island Railroad operates on routine and trust. Platforms flow into doors. Doors close into cars. Cars become narrow shared spaces where strangers sit inches apart without interaction. Each transition assumes safety. That evening, every threshold passed without friction. The train departed on schedule, and with it, the most obvious exit disappeared. Inside the cars, attention softened. Passengers read newspapers, adjusted bags, rested against windows. The environment encouraged mental drift. Ferguson took a seat. Witnesses later said there was nothing about his posture or expression that felt unusual. That unremarkableness matters. It represents another almost moment, a point where danger could have been visible, but nothing demanded notice. Violence often depends on this camouflage. It arrives looking like routine. As the train traveled through Queens and into Long Island, another threshold passed quietly. The train was fully in motion. Leaving now would require timing and awareness. Inside, movement was possible, but constrained by seats, aisles, and doors. The environment itself shaped what was possible. As the train approached the area near the Marion Avenue station in Garden City, passengers were now committed to the ride in a way they likely did not consciously register. Survivors later described a brief stillness before the first shots. There was no argument, no warning shout, no visible confrontation. Ferguson stood up. On a commuter train, standing is ordinary. People stand to stretch, to gather belongings, to move aisles. This was another threshold moment, an action that blended seamlessly into normal travel. The brain dismissed it. Seconds later, the assumptions collapsed. Ferguson drew a 9mm semi-automatic pistol and began firing at close range. He shot passengers seated near him, then moved within the car and into an adjacent one. Witnesses consistently described the attack as controlled rather than frantic. The train continued moving as gunfire echoed through the confined space. Panic spread faster than bodies could move. There were no clear exits, no cover, no way to outrun the environment itself. When the shooting stopped, 6 passengers were dead and 19 others were wounded. The people who lost their lives were Amy Federici, 27, of Mineola, James Garicki, 51, of Mineola, Mi-Kyung Kim, 27, of New Hyde Park, Maria Magtoto, 30, of Westbury, Dennis McCarthy, 52, of Mineola, Richard Nettleton, 24, of Roslyn Heights. Each of them boarded the train expecting an ordinary commute. None had any connection to Ferguson or his grievances. Time fractured for those inside the cars. Seconds stretched. The train slowed but did not stop immediately. This is often where retellings focus, but the structure of this story pivots elsewhere, toward what interrupted the violence. Because the shooting did not end by choice. As Ferguson attempted to reload his third 15-round magazine, the sequence broke. In the chaos, some early witness accounts described the gun as jamming. That perception entered initial reporting. Later official investigation clarified that he was in the process of reloading when the interruption occurred. The distinction matters historically, but the effect was the same. The weapon was temporarily inactive. For the first time since the shooting began, momentum paused. That pause became the most critical threshold of the entire event. Passengers reacted. Michael O'Connor, Kevin Blum, and Mark McEntee rushed Ferguson, tackling him to the floor. Others assisted in restraining him as the train slowed near the Marion Avenue station. This intervention did not come before the violence. It came only after the violence disrupted itself. That timing exposes a difficult reality about confined public spaces. Civilian intervention usually follows a break in momentum, not anticipation. Ferguson was held until police arrived and arrested him on the train. The immediate threat ended there. The broader question, why it happened, remained unresolved in the public mind. During the investigation, Ferguson's handwritten notes became central. They showed that the violence had been framed in advance as purposeful. Yet the people harmed had no role in the grievances he described. Investigators emphasized that there was no evidence of personal targeting by name or identity. The attack took place through access and opportunity, filtered by belief. As the case moved toward trial, Ferguson initially retained prominent civil rights attorneys William Kunstler and Ronald Kuby. They proposed a controversial defense rooted in the concept of black rage, arguing that systemic racism had produced a psychological breaking point. Ferguson rejected the strategy. He refused to claim diminished responsibility and insisted instead that he had been framed, that the weapon and the attack were part of a broader plot against him. He dismissed his attorneys and chose to represent himself. The trial became a prolonged confrontation between belief and evidence. Ferguson cross-examined survivors, questioned law enforcement officers, and attempted to introduce his conspiracy claims into the record. For victims and families, the process was deeply painful. For the legal system, it tested a fundamental threshold, whether belief, no matter how rigid, negates responsibility. In February 1995, the jury returned its verdict. Ferguson was convicted on multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. He was sentenced to 315 years to life in prison, structured to ensure permanent incarceration. The court concluded that, regardless of his worldview, he understood his actions and their consequences. Fourth case. Terminal stations run on a different clock. Trains linger longer than usual. Crews rotate. Cars remain accessible as they wait for the next departure. Riders who stay on board are often tired, waiting, or sleeping. The space feels public, but supervision thins as attention shifts to the next run. That quiet interval, neither arrival nor departure, is where this story begins. On the morning of December 22, 2024, that in-between space became the setting for one of the most disturbing transit killings in modern New York City history. At the southern end of the F-line, Coney Island's Stillwell Avenue station functions as a terminal rather than a pass-through stop. Trains sit idle. Doors open and close without urgency. Automated announcements repeat the same neutral instructions, assuming nothing out of the ordinary is happening. In a system built around constant motion, terminals are designed pauses, ordinary, expected, and largely ignored. Inside one of those stationary F-train cars, Debrina Kawam, 57, was asleep across the seats. She was alone. She was not interacting with anyone. There was no argument, no disturbance, no visible warning that anything was about to happen. According to investigators, she was simply resting while the system waited to move again. That detail matters. Many transit-related homicides do not occur during rush hour or chaos, but during moments like this, when routine replaces alertness and the environment feels neutral enough to lower defenses. Shortly after 7:30 a.m., a man later identified as Sebastian Zapata Khalil, age 33, entered the same train car. Authorities have stated that he and Kawam were strangers with no prior relationship. Prosecutors allege that Zapata Khalil used a lighter to ignite Kawam's clothing while she slept. What followed did not involve flight or panic. Surveillance footage shows that after starting the fire, Zapata Khalil exited the train but remained on the platform, standing and watching as the fire grew inside the car. Witnesses later confirmed that he stayed nearby for a period of time. The train did not move. Doors continued to open and close. Announcements continued to play in the same calm tone. Only after remaining on the platform did Zapata Khalil walk away and leave the station entirely. Emergency responders were called, but Debrina Kawam died from her injuries at the scene. One of the most unsettling aspects of the case was not only what happened, but how little the environment changed while it was happening. The subway system did not shut down. The language of the announcements did not shift. The doors operated exactly as programmed. Surveillance footage later revealed a uniformed police officer walking past while the fire was burning. Authorities stated the officer was in the process of securing the scene and coordinating response, but the image became a focal point of public discussion. It raised difficult questions about perception, timing, and what people expect to see happen during an emergency in a public space. Bystanders later described confusion more than panic. Fires inside subway cars are rare. Violence is not expected to appear without warning in such a familiar environment. That hesitation, the silence before recognition, has appeared in multiple transit-related cases over the years. Cameras captured the suspect's movements before, during, and after the attack, and those images were quickly distributed to law enforcement. But the final step toward his arrest came from civilians rather than surveillance alone. Later that same day, 3 high school students recognized Zapata Khalil from police photos while riding a different train. They contacted emergency services, providing information that helped officers locate and arrest him. Authorities credited the students' awareness and willingness to act as a key factor in the rapid apprehension. Zapata Khalil was taken into custody without incident. Police confirmed that Debrina Kawam was originally from Toms River, New Jersey, and had been living without stable housing. Officials were careful to emphasize that her circumstances did not define her death. She was publicly identified by name, and authorities made clear that she would not be treated as an anonymous statistic. In court filings, prosecutors stated that Zapata Khalil identified himself in surveillance images showing the fire being lit. At the same time, he claimed he had been blackout drunk and had no memory of the incident. Prosecutors have treated that claim as a legal argument rather than an explanation for the conduct. Zapata Khalil currently remains in custody, facing first-degree murder, 3 counts of second-degree murder, and first-degree arson. Under New York law, a conviction for first-degree murder carries a maximum sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Defense attorneys have requested a psychological evaluation, a step that may precede arguments related to competency or an insanity defense. Prosecutors have indicated no intent to reduce the charges, and no trial date has yet been finalized. Federal authorities later confirmed that Zepeda Khalil is a Guatemalan citizen who had been deported in 2018 and subsequently re-entered the United States illegally. While that information added a federal dimension to public discussion, the state homicide case remains the primary legal focus. Every case we tell is someone's reality, not just a story on a screen. Liking and subscribing helps ensure their voices continue to be heard and never fade away. Please show support by liking this video and hitting the subscribe button. Thank you. Fifth case. High Park Station sits on Toronto's Bloor-Danforth subway line, a busy stop bordered by residential streets, schools, and one of the city's largest public parks. On most days, trains pass through without incident. Riders step on and off, rarely thinking about the station itself, only where they're going next. On the afternoon of December 8, 2022, High Park Station became the endpoint of a violent act that began quietly inside a moving train. Shortly before 2 p.m., a westbound subway train had just departed Runnymede Station, heading toward High Park. Inside one of the cars were ordinary passengers, people commuting, running errands, or simply crossing the city. There was no disruption, no visible conflict. Among the riders was Vanessa Kurpiewska, a 31-year-old woman traveling alone. She had boarded the train expecting a routine ride, the same way millions of people do each day. Kurpiewska valued that independence. She had cerebral palsy, and for much of her life, mobility had required determination and effort. Walking independently, navigating public spaces, and using transit on her own were milestones she worked hard to achieve. Her family would later describe how meaningful it was for her to move through the city freely, without assistance. That afternoon, she was doing exactly that. Also inside the train car was Nengjia Jin, a 55-year-old man with no connection to Kurpiewska or any other passenger. At that moment, nothing about his presence drew attention. Witnesses later confirmed there was no argument, no verbal exchange, and no interaction between him and Kurpiewska. The conditions inside the train were defined by normalcy, a fact that would later make the violence harder to comprehend. As the train moved between stations, that normalcy collapsed. Jin suddenly began stabbing passengers inside the car. Vanessa Kurpiewska was attacked. A second victim, a 37-year-old woman, was also stabbed. Panic spread quickly through the confined space. Riders had little room to move, few places to escape. Amid the chaos, one passenger intervened. In court, this individual was described as a good Samaritan. That intervention disrupted the attack and prevented further harm. An action prosecutors later acknowledged likely saved the second woman's life. The train continued toward High Park Station as passengers tried to respond to what had just happened. When it stopped, emergency responders and police were already en route. Kurpiewska was rushed to hospital, but she later died from her injuries. The second victim survived after receiving medical treatment. Jin was arrested at the scene without resistance. Police quickly confirmed a critical fact. The victims and the attacker were strangers. There was no prior relationship, no shared history, and no dispute that preceded the attack. Kurpiewska had not spoken to Jin. She had not engaged with him in any way. She had simply been on the train. In the days that followed, investigators reconstructed the sequence of events using surveillance footage and witness accounts. The evidence showed that the attack began after the train left Runnymede Station and ended when it was stopped at High Park, where police arrived. The violence did not occur on a platform. It happened inside a moving subway car, in a space where passengers were confined together with little warning. As the case moved through the legal system, more details emerged, slowly. Court-ordered psychiatric assessments diagnosed Jin with major depressive disorder without psychosis. There was no finding of psychosis, and no evidence presented that he was experiencing hallucinations or delusions at the time of the attack. Jin himself denied having any mental health issues during his court appearances, rejecting the idea that illness played a role in his actions. Instead, Jin offered a different explanation. In court, he stated that the attack was an act of revenge against Canadians. He blamed Canadian doctors for a failed eye surgery that he said damaged his vision. According to his own statements, that grievance hardened over time and eventually turned outward. The passengers on the train were not targeted for who they were individually. They were symbolic to him, stand-ins for a country he believed had wronged him. This motive was not immediately known to the public. Early coverage focused on the shock of a fatal stabbing on public transit, particularly because it occurred in daylight on a busy line. Only later, through court proceedings, did Jin's stated reasoning become clear. That delayed revelation reframed the event. What first appeared to be sudden, senseless violence was revealed as the endpoint of a grievance that had gone unaddressed until it resulted in irreversible harm. The process of learning these details was devastating for Kurpievska's family. In victim impact statements, they described her as determined, creative, and deeply proud of her independence. They spoke about how hard she worked to live on her own terms and how meaningful it was for her to travel the city independently. Riding the subway was not just transportation for her, it was autonomy. That this independence ended in a place designed for public safety deepened their grief. The broader impact of Kurpievska's death extended beyond her family. The killing intensified debate in Toronto about transit safety, grievance-driven violence, and the limits of reactive security measures. The attack happened in the middle of the day, without warning, in a crowded public space. Transit authorities increased patrols and emergency response presence, while advocates questioned how systems identify people carrying deep resentment before it turns violent. The legal case continued for more than 2 years. During that time, the city moved forward, but the questions raised by the attack did not disappear. How safe are shared public spaces when danger can emerge without visible warning? What responsibility do institutions have when warning signs are internal rather than outwardly disruptive? And how do communities balance accountability with prevention? In February 2025, the case reached its conclusion. Neng Jia-jin pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in the death of Vanessa Kurpievska and attempted murder in the stabbing of the second victim. Under Canadian law, first-degree murder carries an automatic life sentence, with parole ineligibility set at 25 years. The plea removed the need for a trial and confirmed that the killing met the highest threshold of criminal intent. In accepting the plea, the court acknowledged Jin's psychiatric diagnosis while emphasizing responsibility. His denial of mental illness did not alter the outcome. The verdict made clear that grievance, no matter how deeply held, does not justify violence against strangers. The sixth case, November 7, 1975. It was a Friday evening in downtown Toronto, early enough that the city was still active and the subway system was busy with commuters, hospital visitors, and students heading home. At approximately 8:20 p.m., a 16-year-old girl named Mariam Deborah Peters was found gravely injured inside St. Patrick's subway station, beneath University Avenue near Dundas Street West. She would die 4 days later. What happened to her that evening would permanently alter how Toronto thought about safety underground. Earlier that night, Mariam had been visiting her grandfather at Mount Sinai Hospital, located just north of the station. It was a short, familiar trip, one she had reason to believe was safe. When she left the hospital, she walked toward St. Patrick's Station to begin her journey home. Nothing about the evening marked it as unusual. The subway was operating normally. People were moving through the station. Trains were arriving and departing. Somewhere within the station, Mariam was attacked. She was stabbed multiple times. The assault did not occur in front of a crowd in a way that immediately registered as violence. Instead, it blended into the background of ordinary movement. She was later discovered at the top of an escalator, a transitional space where passengers emerged from below ground toward street level. By the time help arrived, the moment for intervention had already passed. Emergency services were called, and Mariam was transported to hospital in critical condition. She never regained consciousness. On November 11, 1975, she died from her injuries. The Toronto Police Service recorded her death as homicide number 44 of 1975. For the people who had been in the station around that time, commuters, transit employees, passers-by, the realization came slowly. Many only learned later, through news reports, that they had shared space with a fatal attack without recognizing it as such. The violence itself was brief. The understanding lagged. The investigation began immediately, but the limitations were stark. In 1975, there were no surveillance cameras on subway platforms or escalators. No video systems to reconstruct movement. Emergency communication options for passengers were limited, and staff were often physically separated from the areas where riders waited and moved. Witnesses could recall fragments, someone moving quickly, a sense that something was wrong, but nothing that could clearly identify who was responsible. Police canvassed the surrounding area, interviewed TTC employees, and appealed publicly for information. Despite these efforts, no arrest was made. The person responsible was never identified. As weeks turned into months, the case went cold. For witnesses, the impact did not end with the investigation. Many revisited their own assumptions, what they noticed, what they dismissed, what blended into the background noise of a busy station. The attack had not occurred late at night in an empty space. It had happened during an active evening hour, relying on the fact that people rarely expect violence in shared public environments. Public reaction was swift and intense. Newspapers questioned how a fatal stabbing could occur inside a subway station without immediate intervention. Parents worried about teenagers traveling alone, even early in the evening. Advocacy groups demanded accountability. The focus shifted away from the unknown attacker and toward the system that had allowed such vulnerability to exist unnoticed. Under growing pressure, the Toronto Transit Commission initiated internal safety reviews. Those reviews acknowledged uncomfortable realities. Station design prioritized efficiency and flow, not visibility. Lighting was uneven. Passageways allowed secluded movement. Emergency communication options for passengers were limited. Staff presence was not always aligned with where riders were most vulnerable. In the years following Miriam's death, the TTC implemented changes that permanently altered Toronto's subway system. Emergency telephones and alarms were installed so passengers could summon help directly from platforms. Lighting was improved across stations. Police patrols were increased. At St. Patrick's Station, certain passageways that enabled isolation were sealed off. Those closures remain visible today. Inconspicuous white-tiled walls now mark where corridors once existed, blending into the station's design. Thousands of riders pass them every day without knowing why they are there. They are not labeled, they do not explain themselves. They remain as quiet architectural reminders of what the system learned only after a life was lost. Despite these systemic changes, Miriam Deborah Peters' case remains unresolved. The Toronto Police Service continues to list her murder as an unsolved homicide. Periodic reviews revisit the evidence, but no new information has led to charges. Each anniversary renews appeals for information, acknowledging that someone may still carry knowledge of what happened that evening. Seventh case. The number 5 train pulled into Brooklyn Bridge City Hall already full, its doors opening onto a crowded platform beneath Lower Manhattan. It was the morning of April 25, 2025, and the southbound train headed toward Brooklyn was operating under ordinary rush-hour conditions. Riders stepped on quickly, filling every available space. The doors closed. The train moved. For the people inside, this was supposed to be another routine ride through the city's core, the kind that ends without memory. Instead, it would end with the first New York City subway homicide of 2025. Inside one of the cars stood John Sheldon, a 38-year-old Brooklyn resident. He was traveling among strangers, sharing the same compressed environment that millions of New Yorkers navigate daily. At some point during the ride, Sheldon became involved in a dispute with another passenger, Luis Jose Duarte, a 46-year-old man. According to police and witness accounts, the argument began after Jose Duarte stepped on Sheldon's shoes. It was a minor physical contact, the sort that happens constantly in packed subway cars. But the exchange that followed did not fade. Witnesses told investigators that Sheldon became verbally aggressive. Police sources later stated that Sheldon allegedly used an anti-gay slur during the confrontation. Voices were raised. The tension drew attention from nearby riders, though at that stage it still resembled many other arguments that erupt briefly and end without consequence. The train continued toward the next stop. The doors remained closed. There was no space for separation, no pause that allowed the situation to cool. When the number 5 train arrived at Brooklyn Bridge City Hall, the conflict did not end. According to multiple witness statements reviewed by law enforcement, Sheldon followed Jose Duarte off the train and onto the platform. This moment became critical to investigators' understanding of what happened next. The shift from train car to platform did not reset the encounter. Instead, it carried forward with momentum intact. Surveillance cameras captured what followed. Court documents later revealed that both onboard train cameras and platform cameras recorded the incident. The footage reportedly shows Sheldon standing directly in front of Jose Duarte on the platform. Within seconds, Jose Duarte produced a knife. Sheldon was stabbed multiple times in the torso, including the chest area. The violence unfolded rapidly, leaving little time for bystanders to react. Commuters nearby responded with confusion and fear. Some stepped back instinctively, others froze, uncertain whether the threat was ongoing or already over. Jose Duarte fled immediately after the stabbing, disappearing into the station. Sheldon collapsed onto the platform, unresponsive, bleeding heavily. Emergency services were called within minutes. Transit police and NYPD officers arrived quickly, securing the scene as paramedics attempted life-saving measures. Sheldon was transported to Bellevue Hospital, where he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Later that day, the New York City Police Department confirmed that his death was the first homicide on the city's subway system in 2025. As investigators worked to identify the suspect, early police bulletins circulated a detailed description. Authorities said the man was wearing all-black clothing, black Beats headphones, and that some initial alerts also noted distinct white patches on the suspect's face and hands. Surveillance footage from the station and surrounding areas became central to the search, as transit officers reviewed video and tracked the suspect's movements after he fled. On April 30, 2025, 5 days after the killing, police arrested Luis Jose Duarte. He was charged with first-degree manslaughter. During his arraignment, Jose Duarte pleaded not guilty. The court ordered him held on a $400,000 cash bond, with alternative options, including an $800,000 insurance bond or a $1.2 million partially secured bond. Prosecutors argued that the severity of the charge and the circumstances of the killing warranted strict bail conditions. As the case moved through the early stages of prosecution, additional details emerged through court filings. According to those documents, the surveillance footage provides a continuous visual record of the dispute, beginning on the train and continuing onto the platform. Prosecutors have indicated that the video will be a central piece of evidence, illustrating how the confrontation escalated rather than dissipated when the environment changed. The defense has taken a different approach. While not disputing that Jose Duarte stabbed Sheldon, defense attorneys have emphasized context and initiation. They have pointed to witness accounts suggesting that Sheldon was the initial aggressor, citing allegations that he used an anti-gay slur and behaved physically aggressively during the dispute. This argument forms the basis of the defense's position that the stabbing occurred within a rapidly escalating confrontation rather than as an unprovoked attack. Another element complicated the public narrative. Law enforcement sources disclosed that John Sheldon had an extensive prior arrest history, with reports citing between 60 and 94 previous arrests. Some of those arrests involved transit-related incidents, including past allegations of assault. Police were careful to state that this history did not justify Sheldon's death, but acknowledged that it provided context for understanding his familiarity with confrontations in public transit settings. Together, these details shaped investigators' reconstruction of the event. The conflict did not reset when the train stopped. It did not reset when the doors opened. It moved forward, train car to platform, argument to pursuit, tension to violence without interruption. This pattern sits at the center of what defines many train-related killings: escalation without reset. As of February 2026, the case against Jose Duarte remains in the pretrial phase in Manhattan Supreme Court. No verdict has been reached. Attorneys continue to file motions, challenge interpretations of the surveillance footage, and prepare competing narratives for a future jury. Updates on court appearances and hearing dates are publicly available through the New York State Unified Court System's WebCrims portal. The 8 case. Roughly 70 passengers were on board. The train was busy enough to feel public, but quiet enough to feel safe. Deborah Lindsley took a seat inside a compartment-style carriage, a design common on British trains at the time. These compartments were enclosed rooms, separated from the corridor by a door. Once inside, visibility was limited. Help was not immediately accessible. When the train pulled away, the space became sealed. Deborah was 26 years old. On Wednesday, March 23, 1988, she had boarded the 2:16 p.m. British rail service from Pettswood, traveling toward London, Victoria. It was an off-peak afternoon journey, not the evening rush. There was no crowding, no sense of urgency, no obvious threat. This was the kind of journey repeated daily by commuters who expect nothing more than to arrive at the end of the line. Somewhere between Pettswood and Victoria, that expectation collapsed. By the time the train reached its destination at approximately 2:50 p.m., Deborah Lindsley was dead. What happened during those 34 minutes unfolded almost entirely unseen. Investigators later determined that Deborah had been stabbed up to 11 times, with at least 5 wounds penetrating the heart. The injuries were catastrophic and delivered in a short, concentrated burst of violence. There was no evidence of a prolonged struggle moving through the carriage. The attack remained confined to the compartment where she was seated. The design of the carriage mattered. Compartment trains created small, private rooms inside a public vehicle. Once the door was closed, what happened inside was largely hidden from the rest of the train. Sound did not travel clearly. Sight lines were blocked. Intervention required deliberate action rather than instinctive response. At least one passenger became aware that something was wrong. A French au pair, seated elsewhere on the train, later testified that she heard a scream. It was sudden and frightening. She did not investigate. She did not pull the emergency cord. She remained seated. At the coroner's inquest, she explained why. She said she was glued to her seat with fear. The coroner criticized her failure to raise the alarm, but her testimony revealed something more unsettling than indifference. It revealed how fear behaves under confinement. Inside a sealed space, fear does not always produce movement. Sometimes it produces stillness. When the train arrived at London Victoria, a British rail porter entered the carriage as part of routine checks. He found Deborah lying on the floor of the compartment. She was either already deceased or so gravely injured that survival was impossible. She did not collapse later on the platform. She was not transported alive to hospital. The violence had ended before the train stopped. Whoever carried out the attack had already left the compartment and merged back into the flow of passengers leaving the train. From the first moments, the investigation faced an almost unique challenge. The crime scene was no longer fixed. The train had moved through multiple stations. Passengers had boarded and exited. The physical environment where the murder occurred had already been altered by motion, time, and human activity. There was no CCTV inside the carriage. In 1988, surveillance on commuter trains was minimal. There were no mobile phones, no discrete emergency alerts, no way for passengers to document what they were seeing in real time. Intervention relied entirely on human decision-making in a confined, unfamiliar situation. Despite extensive questioning, no passenger could identify the attacker with certainty. People recalled fragments, a man standing, someone leaving a compartment, but memory blurred under stress. Timelines overlapped. Nothing solid emerged. What investigators did recover was crucial forensic evidence. Blood at the scene did not belong only to Deborah. The attacker had been injured during the assault, leaving behind biological material. From this, forensic scientists were able to construct a DNA profile of the killer, a remarkable achievement for the late 1980s. But the profile matched no one. The killer left evidence behind, but not an identity. The ninth case. John Alexander Dickman was 46 years old when he was executed in August 1910. His conviction and death followed one of the most debated murder cases of the Edwardian era, not because the killing was denied, but because the system charged with preventing and investigating it failed at multiple stages before, during, and after the crime. On the morning of the 18th of March 1910, the 10:27 a.m. passenger service departed Newcastle upon Tyne, bound for Alnwick, with scheduled stops including Alnmouth. The train was ordinary in every visible way. Third-class compartments were occupied by working men traveling alone, many carrying wages home. There were no patrols between compartments, no onboard communication systems, and no expectation that railway staff would intervene once the train was moving unless a disturbance became unmistakable. This was not considered a vulnerability. It was how the system worked. Early 20th century railway safety rested on assumptions rather than oversight. Compartments were enclosed for privacy and efficiency. Once the doors closed, passengers were separated by walls, locked doors, and social convention. Conductors remained at the ends of trains. Authority existed at stations, not between them. Passengers were expected to remain silent. Interference with strangers was discouraged. Violence, if it occurred, was assumed to announce itself clearly enough to demand attention. The design did not account for quiet harm. John Alexander Dickman, a former sailor with no fixed address and a history of instability, boarded the Newcastle train that morning. He admitted later that he was on the train. He also admitted that he was carrying a revolver. What he denied consistently was where he sat and what he did next. Also on board was John Innes Nisbet, a trusted employee of the Stobbswood Colliery Company. Nisbet was carrying 370 pounds in colliery wages intended for distribution to miners. In 1910, this was a significant sum, and his role depended on trust and discretion. There is no evidence that Nisbet expected danger from the man who shared his carriage. At some point after the train left Newcastle and before it reached Alnmouth, Nisbet was shot. No witness saw the act. What is known comes from what the system failed to notice until it was too late. When the train reached Alnmouth, railway staff entered a third-class compartment and discovered Nisbet's body concealed beneath a seat. Blood was already spreading across the floor of the carriage. Nisbet had been shot 5 times in the head at close range. Medical examination indicated death would have been immediate or nearly so. No alarm had been raised during the journey. No staff member had entered the compartment earlier. Other passengers were unaware that a killing had occurred beside them. The system did not detect the crime while it was happening. By the time the body was found, Dickman had already left the train. This delay was not accidental. It was structural. Railway crime created a predictable detection gap. Violence could occur mid-journey, but discovery would often wait until arrival. That gap allowed offenders to disembark before accountability could begin. In Dickman's case, the system's movement created distance before truth could catch up. What followed would expose a second failure: how certainty is reconstructed after direct observation has already been lost. Police quickly concluded that robbery was the motive. Nisbet's wages were missing. The compartment showed clear evidence of violence, but the investigation immediately encountered limitations. The murder weapon was never recovered. More troubling still was a forensic anomaly that became central to the trial. Bullets removed from Nisbet's body appeared to be of 2 different calibers. Prosecutors argued that Dickman had used a single revolver, loading it with smaller bullets wrapped in paper to make them fit the barrel. The explanation was technically possible and supported by period firearms knowledge, but it was also unusual. Critics argued that it required inference layered upon inference. The money trail offered partial clarity. Nisbet's wage bag was later found discarded down an air shaft near Stannington, largely emptied. Dickman was observed spending money freely in the days following the murder, behavior inconsistent with his known circumstances. His clothing appeared to have been scrubbed with paraffin, a common method at the time for removing bloodstains. None of this, however, placed Dickman inside the compartment at the moment of the crime. Witness identification became the most contested aspect of the case. Several witnesses claimed to have seen Dickman in Nisbet's company before the train departed Newcastle. Wilson Heppel identified Dickman as a man he had seen with Nisbet. Other witnesses, including Charles Raven and Percival Hall, also offered identification. Their testimony, however, was heavily challenged. Some admitted they had only seen parts of the men, not full faces. Others encountered Dickman only after police attention had already focused on him, raising concerns about suggestion and procedure. Importantly, no witness saw the shooting, and none could place Dickman definitively inside the compartment at the time of the killing. Dickman's own account remained consistent. He admitted he was on the train but claimed he sat in a different carriage. He stated that he intended to get off at Stannington, missed his stop, and disembarked instead at Morpeth. He denied entering Nisbet's compartment at any point. The jury was asked to decide whether inference could replace certainty. The conviction rested entirely on circumstantial evidence. There was no weapon, no eyewitness to the act, and no direct proof of Dickman's presence at the scene. This alone made the case controversial. Newspapers debated whether a death sentence should stand on such grounds. Legal commentators questioned the forensic theory. Public petitions circulated. The case became a cause célèbre, raising broader concerns about how justice functions when systems fail to observe crimes directly. The appeal for clemency reached the Home Office. The Home Secretary at the time, Winston Churchill, personally reviewed the case. Churchill acknowledged the seriousness of the doubts raised but ultimately refused to intervene. Clemency was denied. On 10 August 1910, John Alexander Dickman, born 17 May 1864, was executed at Newcastle Prison. He was 46 years old. In legal terms, the case was closed. In structural terms, it remained unresolved. The Dickman case reveals an authority gap that operated on multiple levels. The 10th case. On November 14, 1864, Franz Miller stood beneath the gallows outside Newgate prison. He was 24 years old, a German tailor, convicted of murder. Before a crowd that stretched far beyond the prison walls, Miller faced the final sentence imposed by the British courts. This execution would mark an ending, not just for him, but for a tradition. He was the last person publicly executed at Newgate. Within moments, the punishment was carried out. The law declared the case closed, but even at the edge of death, certainty remained incomplete. According to multiple contemporary reports, Miller spoke quietly to a pastor in German as he stood on the scaffold. The words were brief. Ich habe es getan. I did it. The confession came too late to be tested, challenged, or examined. It did not alter the verdict. It did not answer how or why the crime occurred. Instead, it complicated the story that Britain had already accepted. A confession at the gallows doesn't settle history. It only shifts where doubt lives. To understand why this execution carried such weight, the story has to move backward, away from the scaffold and into the space where the crime itself became possible. 4 months earlier, on the evening of July 9, 1864, Thomas Briggs boarded a train in London. He was 69 years old, a retired banker, and widely regarded as a careful, orderly man. Briggs entered a first-class carriage at Fenchurch Street, traveling east on the North London Railway toward Hackney. Rail travel in Victorian Britain was still relatively new, but it was already trusted. The railway symbolized progress, speed, order, predictability. People believed trains reduced danger by controlling movement. The compartment Briggs entered was designed for privacy. First-class passengers were separated by solid walls, each group sealed into its own space once the train departed. There were no corridors linking compartments, no guards passing through, no communication system to summon help. Once the doors closed, isolation was complete. Another man entered the compartment with Briggs, Franz Miller, a 24-year-old tailor living in London. Nothing about their boarding drew attention. No argument was heard. No alarm raised. The train left the station and disappeared into the night. What happened next occurred entirely out of view. At some point during the journey, Briggs was attacked inside the compartment. He was struck repeatedly, robbed of his gold watch and chain, and forced or thrown from the moving train. His body was later discovered beside the tracks near Hackney Wick, badly injured but still alive. He was taken home, where doctors attempted to treat his wounds. Thomas Briggs died the following night, on July 10, 1864. Britain had never seen a crime like this before. This was not violence on the street. It was not an attack in a public place. It occurred inside a moving carriage, sealed from the outside world. There were no witnesses because the structure of the train prevented them. The design that promised comfort had eliminated oversight. The danger wasn't the train itself, it was what the train removed: interruption. Investigators faced an unprecedented challenge. The crime scene was not stationary. The carriage had continued moving long after the assault. There were no forensic tools capable of reconstructing events inside a sealed compartment. What police relied on instead were passenger records and witness accounts from stations along the route. Those records revealed a crucial detail. Thomas Briggs had shared his compartment with only one other passenger. That passenger was Franz Miller. Within days of the murder, Miller disappeared from London. He boarded a ship bound for New York, leaving Britain abruptly and without explanation. The timing drew immediate suspicion. British authorities moved quickly, sending descriptions of Miller by telegraph to American officials. When the ship arrived in the United States, Miller was identified, arrested, and searched. In his possession was a gold watch and chain. The items were traced back to Thomas Briggs. This discovery became the central pillar of the prosecution's case. Miller was returned to Britain to stand trial later in 1864. The proceedings captured national attention. The evidence presented was circumstantial but cumulative. Miller had been alone with Briggs. Briggs was robbed. Miller possessed the stolen property. And Miller fled the country immediately after the crime. There were no eyewitnesses to the killing. Miller denied responsibility throughout the trial, offering explanations for how he came into possession of the watch. The jury rejected those explanations. The verdict didn't come from a single fact. It came from the absence of alternatives. Miller was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. When the execution took place outside Newgate prison on November 14, 1864, thousands gathered to watch. The scene itself became controversial. Public executions were increasingly criticized as spectacles that inflamed curiosity rather than delivered justice. Miller's death would become a turning point. Within a few years, public executions would be abolished across Britain, yet the case did not end with punishment. The murder of Thomas Briggs exposed a structural vulnerability in railway travel. The sealed compartments that offered privacy also prevented rescue. Guards could not move between passengers. Cries for help could not be heard. Violence, once initiated, faced no immediate resistance. Public concern grew. Newspapers questioned whether railways were truly safe. Railway companies were pressured to respond. One of the most direct changes was the introduction of small peepholes between compartments, later known as Miller's lights. These openings allowed limited visibility between adjacent compartments, reducing complete isolation and increasing the chance that distress could be noticed. The change was modest, but symbolic. This wasn't about seeing everything. It was about no longer seeing nothing. Over time, additional safety measures followed. Improved guard access, communication cords, and later, carriage layouts that reduced full enclosure. The reforms were gradual, but the Briggs case became a reference point whenever railway safety was debated. The murder is widely recognized as the first documented murder committed inside a British railway carriage during transit. Its importance lies not in how extreme it was, but in how revealing it became. The train did not create violence. It created a space where violence could occur without interruption. Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel.